that impulse in the new atheist movement to call the death of religion and call the death of belief is really fascinating from a perspective of students of Buddhism. And I'm thinking of Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, which is a critique of belief, and a critique of the utility of belief. And his conclusion is that we need some sort of practice, and his answer in that book, at least, is a certain form of Tibetan Buddhist meditation, right? Because it's belief free,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's value neutral,
Mm-hmm.
which is a really interesting claim.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, it ignores the fact that the sense of self, for instance, that makes that sort of present-centered, non-judgmental awareness important and valuable is itself a historical object.
Yeah.
Right? Our sense of selves are grounded on 400 years of history,
Yeah.
from the Renaissance through the Enlightenment forward.
Right. And the fact that we would value something that we consider value neutral is itself underlined by a set of values.
Yeah, I think following that up, that what strikes me as most problematic is the valorization of forms of meditation that are about emptying our mind, suspending our judgments, etc., as opposed to thinking of that as a moment within a broader pattern of a critical assessment of ourselves, which is pushing a certain modern trajectory of, like you were saying, knowledge is better when we're distant from it, or knowledge is better when it's focused on an object that's not ourselves, that's outside of ourselves, because we can't get distance from ourselves. And instead thinking, what would knowledge look like if we focus on an acquisition of knowledge about ourselves, about our relationships, about our emotions, about our body, etc., but doing so in an analytical fashion. We're trying to analytically understand that in the context of knowing that we construct the world around us, that we engage in a series of practices, they generate certain outcomes, and we can choose to be ignorant of that, we can choose to be conscious of that and participate in that. But if that's the model that we look at in terms of what meditation or contemplation might be, then it ends up with a vision of a very participatory, very engaged notion of meditation. And in the early Foundations of Mindfulness Sutra, as you know, when they talk about mindfulness of body, etc., they have this refrain they go through, and one of those refrains is that do it internally, do it externally, and then do it both internally and externally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most people find the internal part easy, external part not so bad, third one gets a little amorphous. But if we think about it in this way, then that both internally and both externally points us to the world-building, world-fashioning aspect of contemplation. And in that sense, basically, what we're talking about then is that the world in which we live in is profound. The relationships between ourselves and others, the interstitials between the internal and the external. And that one of the illusions, perhaps, that's been fashioned by the convergence of modernism and Buddhist contemplation is that liberation could be personal.
Mm-hmm.
That in this deep, solitary spaces of ourselves that we retreat to in meditation, that we might find liberation, as opposed to thinking that liberation is going to be in the medium of exactly that culturally laden, cultural baggage, that world that they want to set aside because it's religious, it's parochial, it's specific, for the universal abstract spaces of this glittering vision of modernity, then that really cuts to the heart of some of what some very prominent teachers have been talking about in terms of Buddhist meditation.
Yeah. And I think that it goes very deep in terms of our experience. The term experience has sort of been nixed from a lot of Buddhist discussion in Buddhist studies because of a very interesting article that Bob Scharf wrote. But I think actually there's a way of rehabilitating it in a way that resonates with what you're saying, and that is to recognize, well, I guess I've been thinking a little bit about the history of medicine and reading some historians of medicine. And there's a guy, Shorter, I can't remember his first name, he's at the University of Toronto. And he points out, for instance, that that there are certain psychosomatic illnesses that have become fashionable at different historical periods. In the Victorian era, all these aristocratic women were suddenly having hysterical paralysis. And, that seemed to have happened because of a whole coalescence of different circumstances. And then it seemed to have faded away. It's not that nobody ever has that symptom anymore, but it doesn't seem class-based. It doesn't seem to really happen very often anymore, as far as I understand. And now we have, of course, new things like ADHD and new categories, ever-increasing categories in the DSM for symptoms. So he came up with this idea of what he calls symptom negotiation. So people at almost an unconscious level have these kind of anxieties and senses of distress, and when they go to the doctor or read literature, the categories that they're presented with at an unconscious level actually shape the symptoms that they're going to experience. So that symptoms, he says, manifest in culturally available ways. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way of seeing meditation practice and experiences of meditation as well. We can look at ancient texts and see models of the path, and we can imagine meditators sort of, trying to identify moments like, 5 skandhas, is this sensation, or is it prajaksha, or is it, perception? Is this, rethinking, re-experiencing, re-feeling himself on the basis of these categories that he's been given, and negotiating, not with his doctor, but with his teacher and with the texts and with the tradition, about, what is it that he's experiencing, what comes next on the path to enlightenment. And there are these very detailed maps of the path. And so people are in a more traditional context, meditating and sort of at a half-conscious, maybe unconscious, maybe more conscious level, shaping their experience to these maps. That's not to say that the maps are completely encapsulating all of experience, or that we can't, make leaps out of the map and form a new map. Obviously, it's happened to many people. But I think for most people, that's at least where it starts. And at a very subtle level of our experience, sort of in dialogue with a broader set of categories that are supplied to us by a tradition, by a culture, and that really do create us in a way, in a very profound way. So I think that is sort of off the radar of a lot of the scientific work on meditation, which really just says, okay, we're going to look at states. Now, if we look at states, and especially if we sort of coordinate them with MRI images or something like that, we're just making a blanket assumption that this kind of blob of red means this state. And that state is usually going to be out of our categories, out of our language, so that we might say, well, this is a picture of the brain experiencing compassion. But nobody's really stepping back and asking, well, what do we mean by compassion? How might compassion function in a different way and have all kinds of different connotations culturally for this Tibetan meditator that we're studying? So I'd like to sort of move things away from just states to a deeper consideration of how experience, including meditative experience, is deeply embedded in cultures. And then we can talk also about how we might negotiate certain possible transcendences of those categories and reshaping of those categories.
So in that context, what would you say is the value of humanism, or the value of a humanistic scholar? So we often talk about, look, we're getting together the scientists and the practitioners, and finally the scientists are respecting the practitioners. Maybe they're thinking that the practitioners can be trained first-hand reporters and tell us what's happening and so forth. But I think there's a deeper skepticism about the value of having a humanist in the room. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what the value of humanities is to thinking about this process of the way in which meditation might or is being brought into our culture and into different sectors, and the project of trying to understand that as well as facilitate its possible beneficial uses.
Yeah. Well, I think people who are thinking of meditation in terms of science are often thinking about facts. You know, what's the state of things here? What's the brain doing? What's going on? And what they might not be considering is the fact that they're part of a much broader narrative and a much broader story that itself might be subject to critique and investigation. And I think that's where one of the ways that humanists can come in and sort of give a historical perspective on the very thing that they're doing that they may just assume is kind of the obvious thing to do, but to show that has a history, that doing it the particular way that they're doing it is not just a natural thing. It's something that has come about through various historical and cultural circumstances. I think too that it's very difficult to expect a laboratory scientist to have the kind of sophisticated knowledge of the traditions that these meditation practices are coming from, that I think is almost necessary to understand the practices. And so I think there has to be a constant dialogue between scholars of religion and scientists in order to help them understand how these practices might have worked and may still work in their indigenous contexts. I'm sure there are other things that I'm forgetting right now.
But it strikes me as totally possible that this moment when scientific interest in meditation, which is fairly narrow in terms of identifying objects that are appropriate to scientific study, can expand and acknowledge context, and even make the context of practice the object of study, the object of research. And I wonder if we look through the history of science or the history of medicine, if we see that as a trend. Right? Interesting, fascinating, important, but limited subjects become a focus of intense interest, and these later expand into look at what are initially considered to be ancillary causes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if behaviorism focuses on how we behave in very restricted environments, right? Several generations down the road, right, we can now create a plausible project that looks at behavior in particular contexts, right? And has very finely tuned ways to look at interaction, right, as opposed to a more narrowly defined individualist sense of what human behavior is.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I wonder if we can imagine what this moment will look like. Right? The interest in meditation at this moment will look like in 20 years. What will we see?
Right.
Well, so I'd like to talk a little bit just about the last 100 years or so of how we have tried to articulate alternatives to religion. So not simply saying that religion is passé, but saying here's something that has the positive benefits of religion but doesn't have the negative sides to them. And we've talked about mysticism, mystical experience, spirituality, and so forth. So you can just give us a little bit of a sense of the history of that attempt and how it relates to religion and secularism and the kind of challenges and possible benefits of these alternative ways of thinking about this constructed thing we call religion.
Yeah, so I also take this back to the 19th century, and I've looked a bit into Buddhists in particular who first started using the term spirituality in a particular way, and I think they were drawing in part from Unitarians and Transcendentalists at the time, and that's really where a new understanding of spirituality starts to emerge, and I think really even the distinction between spiritual and something else that you would have seen prior to that would be more like spiritual and temporal, or spiritual and corporeal. And it was deeply embedded in the Christian tradition, and there's a whole history to that we don't need to get into. But when it starts to go global, this happens, on the one hand, in the context of a more robust interaction, sometimes in the context of colonialism, with other traditions, but also people starting to look at non-Christian, Westerners starting to look at non-Christian traditions and see something of value in them, and not just simply dismiss them. And so then it becomes a matter of, well, so how do we make sense of this? We need some common ground, because they obviously have different doctrines, they have different teachings, they have different kinds of social organizations and institutions and so on. And there's also an emerging sort of suspicion of institutions that's really goes all the way back to the European Enlightenment. So all this comes together, I think, in the 19th century, when you start to get a notion of spirituality as something transcultural, as something religious, and as something kind of, almost a kind of free-floating space over and above religious institutions, that all the religious institutions in some ways participate in, but none has an absolute claim to it. So this is a very ecumenical, it's heading towards something that will be called later on perennialism, and it's the idea that there is this kind of unified essence of religion, but that essence actually transcends religions themselves, religious institutions, and religious doctrines and truth claims and so on. So you see this kind of vocabulary emerging during that time. And what's interesting too is that it also is a kind of very structurally similar to the very notion of secularism. That is, the secular is ideally sort of constructed as this neutral space that's non-partisan, it may not be non-politically partisan, but it's non-sectarian. It doesn't, it allows all religions to be there, but we're going to agree that the religions are going to kind of be off to the side here, and we're going to have this space in which we're not going to engage religious questions. It'll just be sort of, questions that we can rationally debate without, supernatural stuff and so on. So that's this kind of neutral space of secularism, in a way, kind of mirrors this space of spirituality. So I think that those two models sort of emerge at the same time, and they reflect each other. So what's problematic about one, I think, is problematic about the other, is that secularism is never really that completely neutral space of rational discussion. There are all kinds of religious and quasi-religious views that get mixed into it. Secularism itself can be wielded as a kind of ideology. It can function almost as a kind of religion. And for instance, in China, it almost functions as the official religion, which is used to marginalize other religions. And so, on the one hand, I think it's a somewhat admirable attempt, the idea to try and find some common ground between all religions. I think ultimately the space of the spiritual, and we see this historically, sort of still gets appropriated by a particular tradition. In other words, Aldous Huxley, for instance, wrote his book on perennialism, and the ultimate absolute reality that he presented really ended up being a kind of Vedanta Hinduism, whereas others may do a kind of model of the spiritual, and it ends up being modeled on a Buddhist metaphysic. So I think the attempt to try and get outside of culture, to try and get outside of institutions, to try and get, is probably has historically not succeeded. At the same time, this term spiritual has really become, in the last 10 or 20 years, or maybe a little longer, so nebulous. It's gone beyond just that. It's something that's deep within, and it's at the same time it's sort of transcendent, and it's in some ways a way of taking this secularized space that we now have and enchanting it, re-enchanting it, making it more magical, reinvesting it with a kind of a magic that in the classical understandings of secularism it was sort of stripped of. So there's a lot of emphasis in current mindfulness meditation practices on appreciation, really appreciating the fine nuances of one's experience, aesthetic experience, sense experience, really looking, really seeing things. And this doesn't involve anything supernatural or anything, doctrinal, but I think that's a manifestation of a kind of re-enchantment of the secular space that's now been created. And I think this also goes back to, at least the kind of literary modernism that began in the early 20th century, where you had authors like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and others writing in a way that is unprecedented, just in a way that really is a kind of fine-grained analysis of moment-to-moment experience. I think that's an important contribution actually to the mindfulness movement that is a little bit behind the scenes and nobody identifies just because it's become so much a part of our culture. But I do find this word appreciation coming up over and over again, and it's something that you would never see in, say, the early meditation suttas. I mean, we were not really encouraged in the Four Foundations of Mindfulness Sutra, for instance, to appreciate the world. Really, quite opposite. You're supposed to, look at your body, not to appreciate, its sensual experience and everything, but just to realize how gross it was, right? To sort of detach yourself from the phenomenal world, the sensual world. So that's one of the unique sort of morphings of spirituality that I think has happened in conjunction with mindfulness.
So what is unenchanted about secularism? God is one answer, right? It's everything but belief in a supernatural power.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But we've had 100+ years of secularism, maybe more, depending on how you count it. And there are generations of people for whom the very idea of God has not been all that meaningful, but who would still say some version of, I'm looking for that enchantment. Right? I'll give you one answer, but I want to know if you have others. That it's emotion. Right? Maybe the emotion is lacking in a straitjacketed version of secularism. We took too much out when we rejigged culture over the course of generations. But what else? What's unenchanted?
Well, I mean, I guess the classical sort of view of secularization, which I don't really agree with, is that the process of modernity is in part a process of sort of stripping the gods and ritual and collective effervescence and ceremony and things like that, stripping those out of life, and what's left is a kind of utilitarian, bleak, mechanistic view of life. I don't think that works as a big picture of secularization, but I think it is a picture that resonates with certain people, and so while it's not an accurate description, I think, of secularization or secularism, it does tap into certain sensibilities that maybe at least a certain population have, and that population tends to be, I think, the kind of educated, not so religious, the nuns, going back 100 years, who often, maybe were raised in a certain religious context and grew skeptical of it, or and they want something more, they want some kind of meaning, they want some kind of emotional connection, but they don't necessarily find it arising from their dominant kind of picture of the world, which is rooted more in science than in mythology or anything like that.
So many of the architects of meditation in America as we know it today were young people. They were teenagers in the 60s and they became adults in the 70s, and they were drawn to meditation initially because it's represented something that simply was not here. It represented pathways around things that they didn't like about U.S. society. One of them being religious institutions, another being political institutions. But what they did in the 70s was they created institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so now as they're entering into later lives, some of them are very successful. Right? And I'm wondering if you see traditions of meditation being created here that will cause an anti-traditional reaction.
Yeah, I think there's always, I mean, I think it's just fundamental to American culture that we have that ongoing tension. On the one hand, it's very difficult to do anything and accomplish anything without some kind of social, organizational context. So naturally, people want to set something up. And it's also difficult for those kind of contexts to survive unless they have something kind of meaty to them. You know, if it's just kind of like, well, you guys, we're all going to get together, but we're all going to kind of do what we want, and you know, that's not nearly as likely to survive as a kind of authoritarian institution. And you know, that's why people are suspicious of institutions. So you know, already I think we see examples of almost ad hoc institutions, some of which may gather around a certain charismatic figure, and you know, those become a matter of debate because people, you know, see this as a kind of cult or a cult of personality, and they're suspicious of that, and they'll try to do something on their own. And there's also the idea that again, I think is a very Western idea, but that the purpose of meditation is to liberate us from social constraints and cultural norms and things like that. So you have these multiple points of tension that I think are just, I don't think there's going to be an ultimate resolution. I think it'll just be an ongoing process in American culture.
I think part of the challenge is that we have such a strong notion of explicit learning, and we think, I will just learn this from a book, I will learn this from a lecture, I'll just get it, I'll follow the procedures, and I'll know what to do. And if that's the model that you have of how you acquire knowledge, then it's perfectly fine to get these things out of context, acquire them in these ways. You don't need a community, you don't need someone telling you what to do, and so forth. But if instead a large degree of the meaningfulness of these practices, as you suggested before, is in the environment around you, then living in a place with a people and participating in a way of life, there's much that's going on at the tacit level where you're not deliberately acquiring this knowledge,
Right.
but you are in fact acquiring the knowledge that you need in order for this practice to have its full significance. And I think that's one of my main concerns about this space. And to go back to that notion of appreciative inquiry, so we were talking about mysticism, spirituality, and now we have many other terms people are throwing around to try to replace this, and appreciative inquiry or appreciation is one, contemplation is another, mindfulness obviously is beginning to fulfill that role for a lot of people. I think the thing about appreciation is that often we misunderstand appreciation or appreciative inquiry as being about appreciating what people bring or just appreciating positive things about them. And I think one of the most important forms of appreciation that's gotten lost in modernity is the appreciation of absolute difference. We always want to erode difference. We always want to appreciate similarity, commonality, we're coming together, and so forth. And often this corrodes our ability to just frankly say, we are different. We do not have the same goals, and yet perhaps we might find a way to appreciate that difference and still be able to interact with each other in respectful ways.
Yeah, I think far beyond mindfulness and meditation, that's the challenge of the world today. I mean, I think we're beyond the kind of utopianism of the mid-century where, everybody was saying, oh, we're at root we're all the same, and we just need to sort of focus on that. I think clearly the challenge now is to appreciate difference and figure out how to live with each other in light of that.